So I ended up talking a lot more about Hume in that last video than Kant or Whitehead. At least I did talk about cognition, that's good. But it was probably necessary to introduce Kant, who, after having read Hume's skeptical arguments about the mind's ability to know the world, was awakened from his dogmatic slumber, recognizing that rationality was limited. The intellect could not know the true world that exists independently of the mind. All that the intellect or the mind or rationality could know, all that cognition was capable of, was knowing itself and knowing how it knows. It couldn't know what it knows, only how it knows it, based on certain a priori structuring principles. But the thing is, Kant is setting up this dualism here. I mean, he inherited this from Descartes' dualism between mind and matter, which allowed Newton to form his mechanics in the first place. He's accepting all of that as a valid critique of human experience. Such that Descartes basically talked himself out of his body so that he wasn't affected by any of its desires or corruptions, or but instead was in touch with these clear and distinct ideas placed in his soul by God, who also created the world. Kant is actually accepting that this ego given by some kind of noumenal being, which in effect structures our reality for us. So Newton's laws are not laws of nature, they're laws, transcendental laws of human perception, and therefore human cognition. But the problem with this is that the way Kant and Hume and Descartes were understanding cognition may have been slightly flawed. It may have been too narrow, such that a lot of feminists in the latter half of the 20th century, for example, criticized Kant with books like this, Cognition and Eros, where it's pointed out that Kant conceived of the rational mind as something entirely distinct from the emotional body. When actually we now can say that science has empirically demonstrated that the cognition-emotion divide is rather an arbitrary one in the actual brain. The limbic system and the prefrontal cortex are always active together whenever we experience something as being true, even a mathematical equation. Unless we emotionally value its truth, it won't be true for us. So, to conceive of this disembodied intellect as though it had perspective-free or emotion-free access to pure ideas is actually a mistake. And I think this is what Whitehead is also pointing out. He recognizes that all of our experience is always already emotion-laden. We are in the world. We feel the world around us. In fact, Whitehead's word for this is that we prehend it. Prehend as we grasp it. It enters us as we open ourselves to it. and he calls it prehension as opposed to apprehension, which is more of a mental function. He calls it prehension because he's saying that this is more of a physical, more of an embodied experience. And so this allows Whitehead, now in contrast to Hume, to say that causality is something we experience about nature. It's not something we assume, it's something we feel. Causality is that which puts us in the situation that we always are inheriting from the past. But it doesn't necessarily determine our future. Causality is what we feel. What we then think about what we feel is not entirely free. It's constrained, and in fact, it's allowed to be a thought by the fact that it has this relationship to these intense feelings. That's what allows the intellect or the rational mind to emerge on top of this whole process and to gain this sense of creation, of self-creation. And it doesn't then become separate from the rest of that process, but we know with our intellect the causes of nature because we feel them. And so Whitehead is rejecting this dualism between mind and matter. He's saying that, yeah, matter is not what we thought it was, as though it were a dead mechanism composed of BBs that just kind of, if you pour them out of a cup, they kind of just drop onto your desk. They're inert. They don't do much. That's not what matter is. And in fact, physics has already accepted this. The public, or just, the average person who hasn't got a PhD in quantum physics or astrophysics or whatever, thinks that matter is still what Newton thought it was. Whereas, the people with the degrees know that it's nothing like what Newton supposed. And materialism, I think, has been falsified as it's not a scientific hypothesis, so you can't really falsify it, but as a metaphysical system, materialism has pretty much been made to be not only empirically wrong because the science doesn't support it anymore, but experientially incoherent because it's trying to reduce everything we value as human beings to the motion of atoms through the void. It's trying to turn all of that value and purpose and reason and enjoyment into bare facts that don't mean anything, but just perform a function, a mechanical function of some kind, an algorithmic crunching of numbers for no particular reason, in no particular direction. If that's your ultimate theory of nature, how do you remain a human being after that point? How do you remain alive? So, materialism is almost depressing and dangerous because it's depressing in that sense, because the person is talking themselves into this view that nullifies them as a creative force in their own right in this universe. So when we think in terms of Whitehead, when we think with Whitehead, instead of Hume and Kant, we're not taking this skeptical position. We're not withdrawing from our bodies and our embodied experience in the world as a fleshly being. Instead, we're diving right into that and seeing that cause is what we feel, what the world gives to us in every moment. That's what causality is. So not only is it real, but it's what we're always in possession